Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Chenjerai Kumanyika. He's an assistant professor of communication studies at Clemson University. Hi, Chenjerai.
Hi, how are you doing?
Doing well, thanks for joining us. A new report on Syria created jointly by Save the Children and Oxfam paints an extremely grim picture of the suffering of the Syrian people. Called Failing Syria, the report found that 76,000 Syrians died last year alone, making it the deadliest year since the conflict began in 2011. More than 5.5 million children desperately need aid. That's a jump of about 1/3 since the year before. Shockingly, international aid has actually dropped as the need has risen. Syrian infrastructure has been so seriously damaged that the number of electric lights visible from space has dropped by 83%. The U.S. has been loath to get involved in the Syrian conflict and has only provided aid, training and weapons to those rebel groups involved in the fight against ISIS. Meanwhile, in Ukraine, where there's been a fraction of the casualties compared to Syria, the U.S. has taken a far more active role diplomatically, citing humanitarian concerns. In fact, the Obama White House yesterday announced it was also sending unmanned drones and aid, but no lethal weapons, to Ukraine's military. White House spokesperson Josh Earnest explained that, quote, bloodshed is something that we're trying to avoid and de-escalate. Chenjerai, do the contrasting policies on Syria and Ukraine point to U.S. hypocrisy?
Yes, I think these contrasting policies really show that the United States uses the language of humanitarianism and avoiding bloodshed, while at the same time operating with very particular strategic, industrial, and military interests in mind. And, you know, the Syrian situation is really complex, and it's not likely to be resolved by any quick solution. Additionally, it's not always clear what the involvement of actors has really accomplished. At the same time, there are varieties of ways that the U.S. could have used its influence in the UN to affect a better situation, and the failure to do so is indicative of imbalanced priorities. One other thing I want to say on this, too, I think we have to reject the idea that the U.S. is somehow working in U.S. best interests, right? Interests that really benefit the American public. Most United States citizens don't really benefit from those kind of priorities, and the Syrians certainly don't. It really benefits a small number of actors with ties to particular kinds of industrial business interests and military interests. So it's a real tragedy.
Here in the United States, tensions between people and police continued in Ferguson, Missouri early this morning as 2 officers were shot and seriously injured. Police in riot gear were present at a protest when shots rang out at about 2 a.m., hitting one officer in the shoulder and another in the face. Both officers are recovering after receiving treatment. It's not yet known who fired the shots, although the New York Times reported that one police officer was convinced that protesters were responsible. Those present pointed out that the shots had come from far behind those gathered, and that both protesters and police took cover when the firing began. Activists had begun gathering last night, only hours after Ferguson's police chief Thomas Jackson announced his resignation. He's the 3rd Ferguson official to resign or be removed in just a few days in the wake of the Justice Department's scathing report on racism in policing. Chenjerai, how do you view the shootings this morning? Are they an indication that things may get uglier in Ferguson?
Well, you know, Sonali, I think things have been ugly in Ferguson for the citizens of Ferguson, due in part to the intertwined racism, violence, and economic violence of the Ferguson Police Department that has now been extensively documented by the Justice Department. But I should say that I think it's a tragedy always when a human being is shot, whether it's an armed police officer or an unarmed citizen. And so, you know, but I think we need a little bit of context here as well. There's been a concerted effort to use the isolated incidents of violence to shut down the 7 months of peaceful protests that have happened in Ferguson. I was there and I witnessed that peaceful protest twice. And, you know, so I think in that context, we have to be able to find a way to create accountability for unjust and cruel acts while preserving the constitutional rights to protest. It's those forms of protest that are actually, you know, uncovering extensive problems with law enforcement.
And finally, a USA Today investigation released this morning has found that the U.S. Army's substance abuse program is in deep disarray. Thousands of people who need care are turned away, and those who do get treatment receive poor care. The report has concluded that more than 24 veterans who received substandard care committed suicide. More than 100,000 U.S. soldiers have fought in a number of wars for well over a decade since 2001, and many of them succumbed to substance abuse and depression. The U.S. Army has for years been criticized for poor care of veterans, but it was thought that public oversight had begun to fix the problems. The Army has vehemently defended its program, but USA Today has found damning evidence that it is failing, and indeed is worse now than before. Chenjerai, what do you make of this report? How seriously is the U.S. failing its veterans?
I think they're failing veterans in a serious way. And this report shows, once again, that the health and well-being of soldiers is really the last priority and really not a priority of the U.S. military. And so that signals a bigger issue, which is that when you consider the cost of human life, the expansion and scale of the United States military is simply not sustainable. You know, politicians talk on the surface supporting our troops and caring about troops. But when we talk about the military, we really talk about wars and security and not enough about the conditions that soldiers actually face and what they live. And when we start using that language and see what it is, then we can really assess the problem that we've established by having hundreds of military bases overseas and just ongoing wars that never end.
I want to thank you so much, Chenjerai, for joining us today. We'll talk to you again next week.
Thank you.
Chenjerai Kumanyika is our daily Newsflash guest expert on Thursdays. He's an assistant professor of communication studies at Clemson University. This is Uprising. We'll be right back.